Welcome to Rising Up for Justice, a special weekly series presented by Rising Up with Sonali, an independently produced subscriber-supported program syndicated to radio stations, free speech TV, and podcast platforms. I'm SonaliKolhatkar, host and executive producer. Our nation and our world are overrun by billionaires and bigots, but they are few and we are many. On this series, exclusive to subscribers of Rising Up with Sonali and viewers of Free Speech TV, you'll hear conversations with changemakers in the movements for social justice and dig into the nuts and bolts of values, strategies, tactics, narratives, and building power. This week on Rising Up for Justice, I'm joined by Mickey Huff, director of Project Censored, which celebrates its 50th anniversary this year. Mickey is the president of the nonprofit Media Freedom Foundation and author of multiple books, including United States of Distraction, Media Manipulation in Post-Truth America, and What We Can Do About It. I've spoken to him many times over the years. Hi, Mickey.
Hi, Sonali. It's really an honor to be back with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about 50 years of Project Censored. So thanks for having us on your program.
Absolutely. It's something that I have relied on over the years. I own multiple copies of the various editions. And for people who aren't familiar with it, we're going to get right into it. So let's start with what Project Censored is. You know, it sounds like something nefarious or something edgy, something a little radical. What is Project Censored? What are its main goals?
Well, thanks again for the opportunity to talk about the project. We were founded in 1976 in Northern California at Sonoma State University by a communications person, someone who was at a journalism and advertising background, Carl Jensen. He started the communications program there. And Carl had a real love for news, and he thought of himself as someone that was pretty news savvy. And what happened in the early to mid 70s, there was a lot of turmoil and change and things happening in the United States. And one of the things that really struck him was not just the Nixon scandals, Watergate in particular, and his ultimate resignation, but it was the role the press played. And it wasn't just the sort of Hollywood version of the press as savior and Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein as great heroes saving democracy. It was actually looking back at what took the press so long to cover a story so significant. By the way, one that J.D. Vance recently said wouldn't be a blip on the radar now. Somehow, I guess that shows how normalized corruption is in Trump's Washington. But Jensen asked, well, the reporting about some of the Nixon scandals were actually happening in the independent press, in the so-called alternative press. And so the genesis of Project Censored was to take the college classroom as laboratory, kind of as a John Dewey experiment, where instead of teaching people rote memorization or just going to the same establishment sources, Jensen wanted to create a whole class that specifically focused on what the independent press covered that the corporate media missed or they didn't cover. Or if they did, they got around to it 18 months or 2 years later, if they got around to it at all. And so Jensen started a class that he called Project Censored. And interestingly, riffing on the name, I guess it's, radical insofar as that it promotes critical news literacy education. And in the 1970s, those weren't even words that fit together. The media literacy movement in the US didn't really get started in earnest until the 1990s, officially and institutionally. But Carl's starting of Project Censored was a really early example of how news literacy education should be a big part of our education, and it should be part of our news ecosystem, where the news is actually interested in itself and in journalism, where journalism and press freedom itself is a beat. In other words, what did the press miss, or what is distorted, or how does media ownership impact the way things are and aren't reported? And Carl was, kind of a forerunner. He was a pioneer in that way. And the one thing that really sets Project Censored apart from other really important watchdog groups, of course, like Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting that Jeff Cohen started 10 years later, in other groups, was that Project Censored had a specific educational component. It wasn't just us sitting around analyzing headlines or picking stories we thought were important that weren't covered. We actually taught students how to think critically about the news, how to survey the independent news landscape, and how to become really news literate citizens. And so the genesis of Project Censored has always then been connected to our trajectory about news literacy education. We do that through our top underreported stories. Carl decided he'd go out and find a whole raft of important and well-established journalists and academics that could help judge the importance and significance of stories. Professors in journalism, communications, and other fields could help students vet and fact check stories. So we have multiple checkpoints in the entire process. And as the years went on, Carl had a really great relationship with Bruce Brugman of the San Francisco Bay Guardian, which was one of the oldest independent weeklies. And Bruce wanted to run Carl's list of stories. And so Project Censored kind of went from this class in, Northern California, kind of a remote place, to something that got out into the weeklies and the independent news weeklies, where they would publish this list every year of the most underreported or censored stories. And Project Censored started to make a name for itself. Other professors started to get interested in it. And then we started to expand that kind of news analysis, not just looking at the news that didn't make the news and analyzing why. But Carl responded to critics in the news industry, people like Walter Cronkite and Hugh Downs. They took notice of what Carl was doing and thought it was a really important way to safeguard the Fourth Estate from its own shortcomings in a lot of ways. And even the great IF Izzy Stone was an early supporter and fan of what Project Censored was doing in terms of raising the awareness of independent media. So Carl, one of the criticisms, Sonali, was that it wasn't fair to say that the news media and the establishment press censored things. It's just they had news judgment, number one. But two, this is before cable, before the 24/7 news cycle, constant news, constant breaking news that broke the news. And so Carl they said, it's not fair. Sometimes we miss things or don't have time or we don't think it's as important as you do. So Carl said, okay, that's fair. So he started paying attention to what the establishment press did cover, and overwhelmingly, he saw increasingly being sort of flooded with what he called junk food news. He coined that term in 1983 to talk about the increased sensational, trivial, and tabloidized kind of material that was creeping its way into the news. And then if you couple that in the 1980s with Ben Bigdikian's media monopoly, looking at the role media ownership played and profiteering played in determining what was newsworthy, and then you look at the groundbreaking work by Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky in Manufacturing Consent in 1988 that gave us the propaganda model to sort of analyze why the establishment press behaved the way that it did. And it really kind of gave, undergirded, it gave a real foundational support to a lot of Jensen's critiques. And I think that by the time we got into the 1990s, by the way, we could add Neil Postman into the mix with Amusing Ourselves to Death in 1985 and Technopoly in 1992, looking at increasingly how technology would shape and transform the news more into a commercial and entertainment sector for-profit business, not one that informed the public about what's really going on. And that's a really important foundation for historical context because it helps people understand how and why the news has changed the way that it has and why we have so many challenges today. We also have simultaneously opportunities, and I'm sure you and I will get to talk about the many positive things and solutions journalism, of which you're so aware, Sonali, and you yourself have done so much important work around solutions journalism, including with Yes Magazine and the program you do now. But again, there's a lot of things I think to talk about sort of through this prism of the history of Project Censored.
Well, what you just laid out is almost a whole ecosystem that people can examine from the outside to make sense of why the news is the way it is. And I'm wondering, I don't know how appropriate this question is, but I'm wondering if that analysis points to the news's censorship and news censorship as an issue that fits within social justice. Because if you listen to right-wing news sources or right-wing pundits, they will scream censorship all the time, but it turns out that their issues aren't censored. So how does the work that you do, how does the work that Project Censored do feed into the idea of justice and social justice, racial justice, economic justice?
That's an absolutely wonderful question, Sonali, and historically really significant. On the first tip, yes, and this is something that we've grappled with over the last decade in particular, as we've seen the rise of the MAGA movement and Trump and so on, is there's been a deliberate weaponization of what a lot of us have been trying to do around media justice issues, around media democracy issues, where a lot of the right have kind of flipped the script and they've turned themselves into victims of the very things that they themselves have long perpetrated. And if you go back to the same Nixon administration that inspired Jensen to start Project Censored, you'll see that there was a great rightward shift. The establishment, the chambers of commerce around the U.S., the corporate owners of media, they started to get really worried about what they saw in the 1960s, the movements for civil rights, the movements for social justice, the LA. The movements for gay rights and liberation that we saw coming out of that period, the anti-war, pro-peace movements, the pro-free speech movements. I mean, we could go on and on. But the Nixon administration really kind of was a catalyzing force where a lot of these right-wing groups got together and they said, we need to counter what's happening in the schools and the universities and in the media to have our own right-wing ecosystems. So curiously, from the beginning, that's kind of the beginning of the trope of the liberal media or the liberal university. And it's true that there are ideas in those institutions that were small L liberal ideas, the ideas of the democratic participation, government transparency and accountability, rights and access to voting, access to accurate information. And basically that's where we started to get things like the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, a bunch of right-wing think tanks and movements to begin creating a right-wing media ecosystem to counter this straw person of a liberal media. I mean, the fact that the press was covering Nixon scandals didn't mean they were liberal. It meant they were doing their jobs. But that trope really stuck, and the Reagan years really helped cement this idea that liberalism was run amok and the campuses were full of socialists. I know so much of this sounds very familiar now, and we talk about that in the foreword of the censored State of the Free Press 2026 book for the 50th anniversary. But there's this idea that there were these movements for social justice that just went too far, and conservatives turned themselves into victims. Even though right now, Sonali, seven of the richest billionaires in the world are all media barons. They basically control most of the major narratives. Five tech companies basically control and platform and algorithmically censor, shadow ban, and curate information for billions of people around the world. We see the right controlling all three branches of government in the United States, yet still they're always going after the boogeyman of leftists. And they're always saying that they're victims. And the curious thing, of course, as you and I know, Sonali, is that that's just another tactic. It's another authoritarian tactic to shut down people who are trying to hold accountable systems that are designed or supposed to be, at least theoretically, to be responsive and receptive to the needs of the public. One area where we see a very interesting combination and a connection between right and left right now in this country is the great mobilization in resisting AI data centers. Some of the most significant battles that are taking place are in small rural towns across the country where people's town councils are selling out the communities to major tech companies, often with non-disclosure agreements, often in shady deals. And we're seeing how government is even failing to be responsive, even if it isn't a quote left-wing issue, right? And so where Project Censored fits in a lot of the social justice movements are that, as you know, Sonali, many of the stories about marginalized communities or particularly from marginalized communities and populations, they have a really difficult time making their way into the establishment press, the corporate media. You'll notice too, we don't use the phrase mainstream media very often because there's nothing mainstream about a handful of billionaires controlling the press for their own commercial for-profit interests. That's why we call it the corporate media, the establishment media, the legacy press, because we think language matters. And it's really important then when we talk about the kind of social justice journalism, movement media journalism, it's important to understand that the key differences there is that the latter forms of media are ones that platform, amplify, and include many of the people that are seeking justice, people that want to be heard, need to be heard, and are trying to rectify and right historic wrongs that violate civil liberties and our rights protected in the Bill of Rights. And so we think that media freedom and media literacy are for everyone, and that if we don't, as Nick Johnson, the former FCC commissioner who's been a judge with Project Censored since our inception, once wrote a book called Your Second Priority, and he said, regardless of what your first area of interest is, whether it's you care about the environment or local jobs or racial discrimination, what have you, peace and justice, peace around the world, anti-war movements. If your second priority is not media democracy, press freedom, and the protection of it, you're likely to gain very little ground in your primary areas of interest because the communications infrastructure is how we communicate with each other. And over the last half century, we, the people, have seen it taken away from us, wrested from us by the billionaire class. And
Right.
what we try to champion at Project Censored is the independent voices and outlets that really do this kind of specific journalism that is of, by, and for the people. And we try to platform it, amplify it, and we teach young people about the significance of what makes independent media so important and why we need to support that ecosystem against all of this other hyper commercial, propagandistic, top-down managed news propaganda that we're just swimming in all of our devices.
Right. If communications and media weren't important, the billionaires wouldn't be grabbing them up. And right.
Exactly.
So they understand the power of the press, and they understand the power of being, having people have access to the truth. So let's talk
Absolutely.
about, I want to talk about state of the free press, because that is such a central part of the work that Project Censored does. I've had you on my other show often to talk about the annual publication, and this year, the 50th publication is being, or is it to coincide with the 50th anniversary of Project Censored, or is this the 50th publication of State of the Free Press?
This is to celebrate the 50th anniversary of
Okay.
Project Censored. We've done the report on the top stories for 50 years.
Okay.
It turned into a book in 1993. And in 1994 and 5, the second, that's still when Carl Jensen was director before Peter Phillips came in. And we had a relationship with Seven Stories Press, and we still do. Seven Stories Press has published our book for many, many years. And then we started the Censored Press ourselves in 2021. And we've partnered with Dan Simon there for a long time. I know you have a great relationship with Seven Stories Press and Greg Ruggiero, a fantastic editor there that I've also had the pleasure of working with in the past. So it's been a book for since 1993. By 2010, we started our national radio program, the Project Censored Show. We've had 3 documentaries done, but this year's book that's been out since late last year is State of the Free Press 26. So this book coincides with our 50th anniversary. And so the theme running through, of course, this year's book does kind of look back at a history of the project and why, unfortunately, we need projects like Project Censored and other media watchdog groups and critical media literacy education groups, human rights education groups, because the challenges we faced haven't gone away. They've actually metastasized and they've even grown. And so the resistance has also grown. And this is what we are trying to celebrate this year is the importance and efficacy of independent media. And we do that each year in our books with a chapter called Media Democracy in Action. And I know you've been part of celebrating this with us in the past as a contributor. That really celebrates the people and the organizations that are doing the kind of work that we need to support First Amendment rights and to actually communicate effectively with the public to have meaningful civic engagement.
And so one of the things that fascinates me about the project that of this book, putting together this book, is that on the one hand you've got your readers who you're trying to educate, and on the other hand you've got the people who put the book together, the student researchers, and in the process of creating the book, you are improving media literacy, right? Because you need these skills to be able to discern what has been censored, what hasn't, and I'm wondering if you can get into that a little bit, why that aspect of those multiple aspects of the book make it so valuable.
I really appreciate you asking that, Sonali, because that's really the core of the project. And like I said earlier, there are other really fantastic organizations that do media criticism and do critical media literacy in that space. One of the things that makes Project Censored unique is our educational component. There are scores of students. We usually work with faculty and students on some dozen campuses, universities, from community college universities, some K-12, but we've mostly been college and universities for, since our inception. But I'd also like to take this opportunity, since your program really focuses on social justice issues and social justice education, to invite educators out there to get involved with Project Censored. That's, again, one of my favorite parts of the project, is that we're honored and privileged to be able to work with scores of students, scores of faculty every year. This past year, again, Andy Lee Roth and Shaylee Voidal co-edited the volume with me. We have Steve Masick, longtime contributor, helping us with the first couple chapters, looking back at historical coverage of previously censored stories, what has happened to them. We also we also have a program that's called our Campus Affiliates Program, and it's a way in which that campuses, classrooms, professors and students can continue to be involved. It's not just the same people every year. We actively invite people who want to get involved to bring an assignment into their classroom. It's called Validated Independent News, or a VINS assignment. And we have this all on our website, projectcensored.org, for free, where you can go in our classroom link and you can get information about a variety of assignments we have for free. We'll come to people's classes, we'll remotely visit classes, we'll do anything we can to sort of not just entice people to get involved in the program, but help support them through the end of it, which means, how do we look for stories? We have whole lists of independent news sources to try to introduce them to students so they understand what's the difference between an independent media source and a corporate media source. Why does that difference matter? And we encourage professors across the curriculum. So, for example, I do work directly with people that teach critical media literacy, but I also work with people who teach psychology. We work with people who teach politics and foreign policy. We work with people who teach environmental studies, for example. Many of our stories are about climate justice and the way corporate media does an injustice to covering the significant things that we're experiencing and have been for decades, that they've basically covered up. And let alone just not covered at all, but like deliberately not covered these stories because of other conflicts of interest. And because, interestingly, Sonali, people that might be teaching an environmental studies course, back to my Nick Johnson, paraphrase about your second priority, when we talk to different faculty and they say, well, I'm not a media class, or this isn't a journalism class. And I say, well, no matter, this is for everybody. Everybody who's teaching something, or every area, every discipline, also needs to think about, how is it represented in the press? How is it represented in the media? Is it represented accurately? Does the Fourth Estate do an adequate job educating the public about science, nature, the environment? Well, the short answer to that is not always. I'll be charitable. Sometimes they do, but often not. And what better place than to take the classroom as a laboratory, as Carl Jensen saw it, and in your environmental studies class, have a unit about media literacy. How does the media cover fossil fuel issues and the climate change? What's the history of ExxonMobil covering up their own studies half century ago, where they knew their products were harming the environment and they decided not to make any of that information available to the public? And when I talk to people that teach these kinds of subjects, right away, they're like, of course, of course. So, but it's because of some of the jargon, journalism, independent media, critical media literacy, that they think like, well, that's not topically in my wheelhouse. But I'm here to tell those people, yes, it is. It's not rocket science. It's critical thinking about the media and how we get our information and whose voices are heard, whose are not, who decides what's newsworthy and what is not. In foreign policy coverage in war and peace, who decides which victims are worthy and which ones are not worthy of discussion, as we see from Ukraine to Gaza and Lebanon. So I think that critical media literacy is for everyone. Project Censored is something that anybody could bring into their classroom. And again, I encourage people to do it. You can visit our website at projectcensored.org. I'm also the Distinguished Director at the Park Center for Independent Media that does the annual Izzy Awards at Ithaca College, where I teach journalism. And parkindymedia.org also has a lot of information about critical media literacy education. That annual Izzy Award, named after I.F. Stone, celebrates some of the best voices in independent media every year. And so if you're looking for more sources or more people to get information from in the independent media ecosystem, in addition to watching shows like your program, Sonali, I encourage people to go and take a look at those lists, take a look at who those people are, and gradually start incorporating them into your own daily media habits and practices, and share them with your networks. You don't have to agree with everything that they do or say. That's not the point. The point is to get more people involved in the independent media ecosystem to counter the relentless and ubiquitous propaganda that comes from the corporate media that is virtually inescapable. And so we need to make deliberate attempts to educate ourselves and to push back. Education is a form of social justice. It's really a form of how education is activism. And it's a long strain of effective propaganda that has worked in this country. And we need to drastically push back against it and seriously push back against it. And one of the ways to do that is through critical media literacy, to deconstruct this kind of establishment state propaganda and show people that movements for climate justice, movement for people having homes, movements for people having healthcare, access to healthcare, those aren't radical ideas. That's what it means to live in a just society and in a proper civilization. Those aren't radical notions and ideas. We have billions of dollars to kill people and destroy the planet. As Abby Martin reminds us, the military is the world's largest polluter, right? We need to push back against those things, and we need to, in a very, and I think a very strong and forthright manner, we need to back each other up. We need to work in solidarity, even when we have some differences in other areas. And we need to demand that these key issues are covered, and not just covered by all media outlets, but covered fairly, covered deeply and historically in ways that the public can really understand that we, the people, have a role, and we're the ones that can right the ship and address the challenges we face together, and not leave the future up to a handful of disconnected billionaires.
Mickey, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Give out that website one more time for Project Censored.
Thanks, Sonali. It's projectcensored.org. People can contact through the website, and we'd love to hear from anybody who would like to get involved in any of our educational programs. It's free to do so, and I'm happy to send books and materials to anybody that wants to get involved.
Thank you again, and congratulations on the 50th anniversary of Project Censored. Thanks, Mickey.
Thanks, Sonali. Pleasure to be here with you.
My guest has been Mickey Huff, director of Project Censored, which celebrates its 50th anniversary this year. He's also the president of the nonprofit Media Freedom Foundation, author of multiple books, and so much more. This is Rising Up for Justice. I'm SonaliKolhatkar, host and executive producer of this new weekly half-hour series, exclusive to viewers of FreeSpeechTV and subscribers of my long-standing program, Rising Up with Sonali. You can find out more at risingupwithsonali.com.